Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Saturday, 9 March 2024. It is the 122nd anniversary of the birth of Ludwig Landgrebe, who was born in Vienna on this date in 1902. In the chapter on the world as history in Landgrebe's Major Problems in Contemporary European Philosophy from Dilthey to Heidegger, which was originally published in 1952 and translated into English in 1966, Landgrebe wrote, according to a still widely held opinion, the philosophy of history is a speculation on the course of world history as it has been explored by the science of history in the form of subsequent reflection. This reflection, in separation from the course of history, seeks to answer the question whether there is any meaning to be found in the course of historical events, either in the sense of a progress toward a definable goal, or conversely, in the sense of a process of decline, or in the sense of a cyclical movement of the return of identical formal structures. This question thus asks in the final analysis whether a general law can be observed or established in these historical movements, unquote. This gives the appearance of critically assessing several different kinds of speculative philosophies of history, but I take it to be primarily a repudiation of Hegel. I could be wrong about that. As we'll see, I think it also implicitly refers to others, but primarily I think the target is Hegel. And once a philosopher of history has reached the point of a ritual renunciation of Hegel, which most do usually reach this point, sometimes also throwing other speculative philosophers of history into the bargain, so that the same gesture can be used to distance themselves from Spengler and Toynbee. And this may be Landgrebe's purpose in his formulation quoted above, which is broad enough to include Hegel, Spengler, and Toynbee. But the next step is crucial, since it reveals the alternative path the philosopher will take. One of these paths could be analytical philosophy of history, and it should be noted that analytical philosophy of history is different from analytical philosophy when we contrast this to continental philosophy. So there are continental examples of analytical philosophy of history like Georg Simmel and Raymond Aron. Another pathway that a philosopher could take is that of providential philosophies of history, which have to take special pains to distance themselves from speculative philosophy of history because they would be so easily mistaken for that. The path that Landgrebe took was a phenomenological philosophy of history, which is as distinctively different from providential or naturalistic or speculative philosophies of history that these different philosophies are from each other. But there was really never any question of what direction Landgrebe would take, because Landgrebe had already been set on the path of phenomenology years earlier. Landgrebe had been Husserl's personal assistant from 1923 to 1930, and it was Landgrebe who edited some of Husserl's manuscripts together to create the volume that we now have as Experience and Judgment, Investigations in the Genealogy of Logic. Several of Landgrebe's papers on phenomenological philosophy of history were collected together in the book Phenomenology und Geschichte, published in 1968. That has never been translated into English, and as far as I've been able to discover, none of the papers included in that collection have been translated into English. There are 9 papers in the volume, some on Kant, one on the end of history, a couple on Hegel, etc. There are 3 other papers that have been translated into English, which were not included in this book, which are Phenomenology as Transcendental Theory of History, a meditation on Husserl's statement, History is the Grand Fact of Absolute Being, and The Life World and the Historicity of Human Existence. In this latter paper on the life world and historicity of human existence, Landgrebe takes a distinctively phenomenological perspective in asking about the presuppositions of history. Quote, The being of the world is presupposed as a steady becoming in which nothing is fixed. But this presupposition likewise presupposes a history of this world in which the becoming of humanity is only a short and late moment in a great cosmic becoming. Thus, it presupposes that there is such a history which encompasses this short moment, unquote. This identification of presuppositions was central to the phenomenological method, with the ideal of a phenomenological philosophy being the convergence upon a purely presuppositionless philosophy. Husserl himself called this the principle of freedom from presuppositions. Quote, an epistemological investigation that can seriously claim to be scientific must satisfy the principle of freedom from presuppositions. This principle, we think, only seeks to express the strict exclusion of all statements not permitting of a comprehensive phenomenological realization. Every epistemological investigation that we carry out must have its pure foundation in phenomenology, unquote. That is from Husserl's Logical Investigations, which was one of his earliest works published. Many philosophers have declared this ideal of presuppositionalist philosophy to be impossible, but Husserl viewed it as fundamental, and it largely defines his philosophical activity. And that influence has then been taken up by those he influenced, and he influenced Landgrebe quite directly. As I said, Landgrebe was Husserl's assistant for 7 years. Presumably, a philosophy of history formulated on this fundamental principle of freedom from presuppositions would seek to identify and then set aside the presuppositions of history. Bracketing them was the terminology Husserl used, so as to get at the things themselves of history, whatever these things themselves might be. There's also, in this passage that I quoted, a hint of naturalism, complete with a Copernican reflection on the smallness of humanity in the universe, which here becomes the smallness of human history within the history of the cosmos. Humanity is, Landgrebe says, short and late in cosmic becoming. Another passage from Landgrebe makes a similar point. Quote, but where and how is there such a larger history, and how can we be justified in speaking of it? History is only there for those who themselves stand within it and who remember what happened early in their lives, who can be taught about still earlier times through some sort of tradition. One can even theoretically reconstruct, as cosmic history, much earlier times before the beginning of mankind. In view of this, natural understanding will say this cosmic occurrence of nature is both earlier and older than man. In the immeasurable time of nature, man is only a passing shadow, unquote. These two quotes remind me of the later work of Karl Löwit, which could be called naturalism with overtones of existential phenomenology. But the implicit naturalism of these two quotes is difficult to square with Landgrebe's phenomenology. I've mentioned Husserl in several previous episodes, and that Husserl's phenomenology is built on the idea of a non-naturalistic foundation for natural science, and Landgrebe seems to have a foundational view similar to that of Husserl. A couple more quotes from Landgrebe's paper, Phenomenology as Transcendental Theory of History, flesh out this ambiguity for us. Quote, history is in no way merely a history of nature. True indeed, natural occurrences form its ground, but not at all in the same sense of matters that could not be further defined. Rather, they are known to us as the earth, that is, as the totality of the conditions which set the boundaries for all the activities of man, and consequently for his history in the sense of res geste, unquote. And a little further along, quote, earth is a transcendental limiting concept. It is a fundamental structure of the human life world and denotes at the same time the limit with reference to which all our talk of nature can only gain for us an intuitively fulfillable sense, unquote. Here again, we see the apparent naturalism of natural occurrences as the ground of all history, and then the assertion of earth as a transcendental limiting concept, which doesn't seem particularly naturalistic. So what if we were to transcend Earth itself, as we do when we go into space, and we experience natural occurrences which are not limited by Earth? Does that mean that our transcendence of Earth falsifies this conception of Earth? or that Earth, as used by Husserl and Landgrebe, means something different from our planet? Or again, does it mean that the human life world has transcended Earth and has, by dint of that, been forced to expand and becomes the spatial equivalent of the expansion of our historical consciousness as we have learned about prehistory and have projected ourselves into the distant future? I don't think Landgrebe or Husserl gives us a definitive answer to any of these questions. Husserl did, I will say, anticipate them without answering them, but I will leave that for another time and I won't attempt an exposition today. But I will say that this aspect of Landgrebe's thought bears comparison with Husserl's anti-Copernican essay, Foundational Investigations of the Phenomenological Origins of the Spatiality of Nature, which I mentioned in a previous episode. So far, I've only been emphasizing Landgrebe's relationship to Husserl, but Kant and Heidegger were probably equally significant influences on Landgrebe. In all the posts that I've written for my philosophy of history space on Quora over the past several years, I haven't yet attempted to write about Heidegger and philosophy of history, even though in my episode on philosophy of history before Augustine, I argued for the legitimacy of implicit philosophy of history based on the principles any given philosopher espouses. So I'm assuming there could be a Heideggerian philosophy of history, but I have not myself attempted to tease that out. Partly this is because Heidegger just isn't simpatico for me, so I find it impossible to give a fair exposition of his work. So here I'm only going to touch on Heidegger in passing because he's such an important influence on Landgrebe. The chapter on the world as history that I quoted earlier begins on a thoroughly Heideggerian note. Quote, "History is a fundamental structure of Dasein as being in the world and therefore of world itself," unquote. Dasein is a German word that is usually can be translated literally as being there. Some works of philosophy leave it untranslated and render the German Dasein within the English text, and some translate it as human existence. I'm sure it's been rendered in other ways. But Dasein serves as a kind of surrogate for the person or the self in Heidegger's writing. So Landgrebe goes on to say, quote, "To elucidate this concept of historicity and to investigate its connection with the fundamental structures of the world is one of the basic problems with which contemporary philosophic thinking is preoccupied. However, the problem becomes articulate only gradually in the process of the repudiation of opposite tendencies," unquote. I assume that the opposite tendencies that Landgrebe is referring to here include the speculative philosophies of history that I earlier characterized as a repudiation of Hegel. And we have to get past these traditional conceptions of philosophy of history before we can break new ground with what Landgrebe calls a new style of questioning. And Landgrebe continues here, quote, "Hand in hand with this development goes a new conception of the nature and the objectives of the philosophy of history. And from the central significance which attaches to historicity within the total contexture of the structures of human Dasein derives the insight that the philosophic inquiry into the nature of history ceases to be merely one special problem among others, but presents itself as a fundamental problem which determines the structure of philosophy as a whole," unquote. As I read this, Landgrebe is saying that philosophy of history gets absorbed into philosophy as a whole, which is then going to be the analysis of human Dasein, which is essentially the Heideggerian project. The historicity of being then becomes coextensive with philosophy of history. But we can also give this idea a more phenomenological and less explicitly Heideggerian formulation. For example, Landgrebe takes the title of his paper, A Meditation on Husserl's statement, "History is the grand fact of absolute being," from the final paragraph of addendum 32 to Husserl's Crisis. And this addendum has not been translated into English, even in the English edition of the Crisis. But I found the German text, and here is a highly imperfect rendering of the final paragraph that was Landgrebe's inspiration for the title of this paper. Quote, "In absolute terms, every self has its history, and this history is only as a single subject. And every commutative community of the absolute selves, of absolute subjectivities in full concreteness to which the constitution of the world belongs, has its passive and active history and is only to be found in this history. History is the great fact of absolute being, and the ultimate questions, ultimate metaphysical and ultimate teleological questions, are one with the questions about the absolute meaning of history." Unquote. This shows, I think, the radically historical conceptions of the later Husserl, which Landgrebe took as his point of departure. And again, as with the more Heideggerian formulation, history and being coincide, but here the emphasis is on history rather than on being or Dasein. And we don't necessarily see philosophy of history absorbed into a larger philosophical project to which it is merely an adjunct and therefore in which it gets lost. So in this paper, in which Landgrebe quotes this passage from Husserl in the title, Landgrebe formulates his task in the following way, quote, "It remains for us to risk an attempt to think Husserl's fragmentary and seemingly unsolvable thoughts a step further in order to be able to understand their inner sense and relation. The question which must thereby be answered is, what is history, and to what extent can it become the central subject matter of phenomenological analysis, and what character must a phenomenological philosophy of history have?" Unquote. Landgrebe then breaks this question down into three narrower, more specific questions. Quote, if a phenomenological philosophy of history is to be possible, then it must be capable of making statements about the subject of history. How can phenomenology define this subject? 2, how is the facticity of history compatible with the claim of phenomenology that it leads to insights into essences which have unconditioned universality? 3, how can a phenomenological analysis make the unity of history understandable? Unquote. He sketches an answer to each of these questions, but I am primarily interested in the third claim. The paper goes on, Landgrebe devotes several pages to each of these individual questions, so he goes into it in quite some detail. But I'm only going to consider some of his remarks on the final question about how can a phenomenological analysis make the unity of history understandable? And part of the reason I'm interested in particularly in this question is because the unity of history can be made understandable only if history does in fact possess a unity. What if it doesn't? In other words, the unity of history has been presupposed, and as we've seen earlier, a phenomenological philosophy of history should concern itself with the identity and bracketing of presuppositions, not the introduction of new presuppositions. In his discussion of this third question, Landgrebe formulates yet another question, which I think is quite on point. Quote, how does one get from the originary experience of the time of our existence in the world as our history to the representation of the uninterrupted temporal series of succession in which all events are represented as a continuous flowing, which is scientifically grasped through the category of causality? Unquote. In my episode on philosophy of history before Augustine, I argued that there is a disconnect between the philosophy of time and the philosophy of history, and that these two should be bound up in each other. Husserl, like Augustine, was a rare philosopher to have formulated both a philosophy of time and a philosophy of history. So he was in a position to overcome this disconnect, or at least to point the way toward its eventual overcoming. I don't think Husserl did this, but Landgrebe's question gets us a step closer by making the question explicit. That is to say, identifying the presupposition that events represented as a continuous flow is derived from the originary experience of time. Landgrebe says that Husserl's response to the problem of unity is through teleology, and he says he won't attempt to tackle it head on. Quote, it is not possible here to give a just representation of the concept of teleology and thereby to demonstrate whether it is sufficient to make the unity of history understandable, unquote. A little further on, Landgrebe drops a hint that I think is the right approach. Quote, the unity of the time of history exists nowhere as pre-given, but it is rather produced anew by men in their actions and in the remembering which is necessary for this action, and in each case conceived of in a new manner. It depends on the manner in which this unity is produced or lost, whether the existence of each man in his time and his era can be a happy existence or one which leads to destruction, unquote. If in Landgrebe's third question about making the unity of history understandable, what he really means is the unity of time and history, then that would be an explicit attempt to bridge what I have identified as a disconnect between philosophy of time and a philosophy of history. So if that's what Landgrebe means, I thoroughly approve, and I think it needs to be followed up on. Further, if the unity of time and history is nowhere pre-given, all the better, because a pre-given unity would be a presupposition. But I do find it a bit curious that he identifies the way in which this unity is achieved, or the way in which this unity fails to be achieved, is a source of human happiness or destruction. This implies that there are a multitude of ways in which the unity of time and history could be affected. Perhaps there's also a multitude of multiplicity of ways in which the unity of time and history can fail. Some of these may be conducive to human felicity, and some of these may be conducive to human destruction. And that is a heavy burden for the philosophy of history to bear, but something that certainly merits looking into further. So happy birthday, Ludwig Landgrebe, and thanks for listening.